"Sir, we just got a name." The voice crackled over the radio, low and uncertain. "Hale." The line went quiet after that, not because the signal dropped, but because no one on the other end seemed willing to speak first, as if the name itself carried weight, the kind that pressed down on a room and made even seasoned men pause. Miles away, under a pale afternoon sun that baked the asphalt into a wavering shimmer, Thomas Hale sat alone in a worn wheelchair at the edge of a gas station parking lot just off Highway 61, the kind of place where 18-wheelers idled and dust clung to everything, his posture slightly slouched, his left pant leg neatly folded and pinned where his leg had once been, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, as if conserving energy. As if he had learned long ago that movement should always have a purpose. Around him, engines rumbled to life, low and aggressive, a pack of motorcycles pulling in with the sharp growl of tuned pipes, chrome flashing in the sunlight as the riders rolled to a stop in a loose circle that wasn't quite accidental, boots hitting the ground one by one, heavy, deliberate, their laughter carrying across the lot with a careless edge that didn't belong to the quiet hum of the place. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, leather vest patched and worn, tilted his head as he looked down at the old man, not with curiosity, but with the casual dismissal reserved for something already judged and found lacking. "You lost, old-timer?" he asked, voice edged with amusement, as if the question itself were part of a joke everyone else was already in on. Thomas didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond them, past the gas pumps, past the highway, as if he were listening to something far away, something none of them could hear. Another rider circled closer, his boots crunching softly on gravel as he nudged the front wheel of the chair just enough to shift it a few inches, testing, measuring, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. "You hear him?" the second man said, louder now, drawing attention, drawing a small audience from the edges of the lot, a truck driver leaning against his cab, a cashier watching through the glass, the world tightening just slightly around the moment. Thomas blinked once, slow and deliberate, his eyes clear, steady, the kind of stillness that didn't invite confrontation but didn't retreat from it either. A faint breeze carried the scent of fuel and hot rubber, tugging lightly at the frayed edge of his old field jacket, where a faded patch clung stubbornly to the fabric, its details worn down by time but not entirely erased. One of the bikers noticed it, his smirk widening as he leaned in, close enough to study it, close enough to reach. "What's this supposed to be?" he muttered, half to himself, half to the others, his fingers hovering for a second before brushing against the cloth. The contact was light, almost careless, but something in the air shifted, subtle, nearly invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction. Thomas's hand moved just slightly, not fast, not threatening, simply enough to rest over the patch, covering it, his voice finally breaking the silence, low and even, carrying farther than it should have. "You shouldn't be doing that." There was no anger in it, no raised tone, just a statement placed carefully into the space between them. The biker chuckled, straightening up, unconcerned, the group feeding off the ease of it, the imbalance of it, the assumption that nothing here could possibly challenge them. But somewhere far beyond the heat and dust of that parking lot, inside a quiet operations room where screens glowed and radios whispered, a different kind of silence had already begun to spread, the kind that comes when a single name connects to something older, deeper, and not yet finished. The laughter lingered a moment longer, but it did not grow the way it usually did when a crowd sensed weakness. Instead it hovered, uncertain, as if something about the old man's tone had slipped past their expectations and settled somewhere they could not quite name. The tall biker shifted his weight, glancing at the others as if to confirm the script had not changed, that this was still simple, still easy, still theirs to control, and then he shrugged it off with a grin that came a fraction too late. "You hear that?" he said, louder now, performing again. "We got ourselves a warning." A few chuckles followed, thinner this time, less certain, carried away by the dry wind that pushed across the open lot and rattled a loose sign above the gas station door. Thomas Hale did not move. His hand remained resting over the worn patch, fingers relaxed, not guarding it with tension but with familiarity, as if it had been there so long it no longer needed protection, only acknowledgement. His eyes lifted slightly, not toward the men, but toward the horizon beyond them, where the highway stretched out in a long gray line that shimmered under the heat, and for a brief second his expression changed, not into anger or fear, but into something older, something distant, like a man measuring time by a different standard than the one unfolding around him. One of the bikers, younger than the rest, hesitated at the edge of the group, his gaze flicking between the patch and the man's face, picking up on something the others ignored, a stillness that did not match the situation, a calm that did not belong in the middle of mockery. He stepped closer, slower this time, and leaned in just enough to see beneath the frayed stitching, where faint lettering and a shape barely held together by age formed something almost recognizable. "Hey!" he muttered, not as loud as before. "This looks like—" He did not finish the sentence. The older rider cut him off with a dismissive wave, unwilling to let the moment shift. "It looks like junk," he said, sharper now, as if correcting the narrative before it could drift, and he reached again, this time more deliberate, tapping the edge of the patch with 2 fingers. The contact was light, almost careless, but the reaction was not what he expected. Thomas's head turned slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet the man's for the first time, and there was no challenge in them, no threat, only a quiet clarity that made the biker's hand withdraw without him fully understanding why. "You really should not," Thomas said again, softer now, as if the statement were not meant to warn, but to inform. The words settled differently this time, not landing as resistance, but as certainty, and that difference moved through the group like a subtle shift in pressure, enough to make one man glance over his shoulder, enough to make another clear his throat and adjust his stance. Across the lot, inside the small operations room where the name had first been spoken, a man in a dark uniform leaned forward over a console, his jaw tightening as data populated the screen in quiet succession, service records, deployment logs, fragments of a history that had not been meant to surface again. "Confirm identity," he said, voice low, controlled, but carrying an edge that changed the posture of everyone in the room. A second voice answered almost immediately. "It is him, sir." There was a pause after that, brief but absolute, the kind that marks a decision already made. Back in the heat of the parking lot, the rumble of engines seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a heavier silence that none of the bikers could quite explain, a sense that the balance had shifted without any visible cause, that something had already been set in motion beyond their reach, and at the center of it, Thomas Hale sat exactly as he had before, still, composed, as if he had all the time in the world. The younger biker took a step back without realizing he had done it, his boots scraping softly against the grid of the parking lot, his eyes still locked on the faded patch as if it were trying to tell him something he could not quite hear. The others noticed the movement, subtle but out of place, and for a brief moment the loose circle around Thomas Hale lost its shape, tensions slipping into the spaces between them. The tall rider frowned, irritation creeping in where amusement had been, and he glanced toward the highway as if searching for something to anchor himself again, but all he saw were heat waves and distant trucks rolling by, unaware of the quiet shift happening just a few yards off the road. "What, you getting spooked now?" he muttered, though there was less bite in his voice than before, and when he looked back at Thomas, the old man had not changed at all, still seated, still composed, his hand resting over the patch as if it were simply another part of him, not an object to defend. A long second passed, stretched thin by the dry air and the low hum of engines idling nearby, and then something else crept into the moment, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the distant traffic, a rhythm that did not belong to the highway, too controlled, too precise. One of the bikers turned his head slightly, brow tightening as he listened, the sound threading its way through the open space, growing just enough to be noticed but not enough to be understood. Thomas's eyes shifted again, this time not toward the horizon, but slightly upward, as if acknowledging something long before it became visible to anyone else. Across town, inside the operations room, the man at the console straightened, his posture sharpening as new information flowed in, coordinates aligning, signals confirming, and he did not need to raise his voice when he spoke because everyone was already listening. "Deploy nearest team," he said, each word measured, leaving no room for hesitation. A hand moved across a panel, a confirmation light flickered, and somewhere beyond the walls of that room, engines came to life with a purpose entirely different from the restless idling in the parking lot. Back outside, the younger biker swallowed, his earlier curiosity now replaced by something closer to unease, and he glanced again at Thomas, really looked this time, at the steady hands, the unmoving posture, the quiet certainty that seemed to hold the entire scene in place. "Man," he said under his breath, not quite addressing anyone, "this does not feel right." The tall rider exhaled sharply, shaking off the tension as if it were an inconvenience. But even he could not ignore the way the air had changed, the way the casual noise of the lot had dimmed, conversations lowering, eyes turning, people sensing without understanding that something was about to arrive. The distant sound grew clearer now, no longer mistaken for traffic, a low, controlled presence approaching with intent, and one by one, heads began to turn toward the source. Thomas Hale did not react to the sound the way the others did. He did not search for it, did not shift in anticipation. Instead, he adjusted his grip slightly on the armrest, a small, practiced movement, and let out a slow breath that seemed to carry years within it, his gaze steady, as if he had been here before, not in this place, not with these people, but in moments where everything hinged on patience, where the outcome was already moving toward him long before anyone else could see it, and as the first dark shape appeared at the far edge of the lot, cutting through the heat haze with quiet precision, the balance that had once belonged to the bikers slipped away completely, leaving them standing in a silence they had not chosen and could no longer control. The first vehicle did not arrive with flashing lights or sirens, only a quiet, controlled glide across the edge of the lot, matte black against the sun-bleached concrete, its engine low and steady like it was built for distance, not attention, and yet every eye tracked it without being told to. The second followed close behind, then a third, spacing precise, movement deliberate, each one slowing in perfect unison as they turned in, tires rolling over gravel with a muted crunch that seemed louder than the earlier laughter had been. No doors opened at first. The engines idled. The heat shimmer wrapped around them, distorting the outlines just enough to make the moment feel unreal, suspended between what had been and what was about to be. One of the bikers shifted his stance, then another, boots adjusting against the ground as if they suddenly needed to find better footing, but there was nowhere to go that did not feel exposed. The tall rider swallowed, his jaw tightening as he tried to hold on to the same confidence he had carried in just minutes earlier, but it did not fit anymore, not with the way the air had gone still, not with the way even the distant highway noise seemed to have pulled back. A door opened. Then another. The sound was clean, sharp, controlled. Men stepped out, not rushed, not aggressive, each movement measured, each posture aligned with a discipline that did not need to announce itself. They wore no unnecessary display, no raised voices, no visible urgency, and yet everything about them shifted the space around them, as if the ground itself recognized the difference. One of them paused beside the lead vehicle, his gaze sweeping once across the scene, taking in the motorcycles, the loose formation of riders, the old man at the center, and then it stopped. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. It simply settled, like something finding its mark after a long search. Thomas Hale did not look surprised. He did not straighten or prepare himself. He simply turned his head a few degrees, acknowledging their presence the same way he had acknowledged the wind earlier, as something expected, something already accounted for. The younger biker felt at first the shift from uncertainty into something heavier, something undeniable, and he stepped back again, this time fully aware of it, his eyes moving from the men by the vehicles to the old man in the chair, connecting pieces he did not understand but could no longer ignore. The tall rider exhaled slowly, his earlier grin gone, replaced by a tight line as he watched one of the newcomers begin to walk forward, each step even, unhurried, boots landing with a quiet certainty that carried farther than any raised voice could have. No one told the bikers to move, but they did, just slightly, just enough to open a path they had not intended to give. The man approaching did not look at them. Not yet. His focus remained fixed ahead, on Thomas, and with each step, the distance between past and present seemed to collapse into something immediate, something undeniable. Somewhere behind him, another door closed softly, another figure stepping into position, the formation taking shape without instruction, without hesitation. The parking lot, once scattered with noise and motion, had become still, held in a kind of quiet that did not ask for attention but commanded it completely, and at the center of it, Thomas Hale rested his hand lightly over the worn patch, his gaze steady, as if the moment unfolding was not a surprise, but a continuation of something that had never truly ended. The man approaching stopped 3 feet in front of Thomas Hale, close enough to see the fine lines etched into his face, the faint tremor in his fingers, the quiet weight of years carried without complaint, and for a moment, he said nothing, his posture straight, his presence steady, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before he stepped out of the vehicle. Then, without hesitation or performance, he brought his hand up in a crisp, controlled motion and rendered a salute, precise and unwavering, the kind that carried meaning far beyond the gesture itself. The sound of boots shifting behind him followed almost instantly, a synchronized echo, and within a heartbeat, every man who had arrived stood at attention, their movements aligned, their focus locked on the seated figure before them. The shift was absolute. The bikers did not understand the language of it, not fully, but they understood enough to feel it, enough to recognize that whatever hierarchy they had assumed no longer applied, that they were now standing inside something they had not been invited into and could not control. The tall rider's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came, his earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of a reality that had arrived without warning and without explanation. The younger biker lowered his gaze, the image of the worn patch now burning in his mind with a clarity that made his earlier assumptions feel distant, almost foolish. Thomas Hale looked up at the man saluting him, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if this moment did not elevate him, did not surprise him, but simply acknowledged something that had always been there. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand from the armrest and returned the salute, not with sharp precision, but with a quiet familiarity, the motion of someone who had done it 1,000 times in places far removed from this dusty parking lot. The man in front of him lowered his hand, but his posture did not relax, his respect remaining visible in the way he stood, in the way he spoke when he finally broke the silence. "Sir," he said, his voice low, controlled, carrying across the lot without force. "We have been looking for you." The words settled into the air, not loud, not dramatic, but final, and in that moment, the entire scene reorganized itself around their meaning. No one laughed. No one moved unnecessarily. Even the distant hum of the highway seemed to fade, as if the world itself had chosen to step back. One of the bikers shifted again, this time not out of curiosity or irritation, but out of instinct, stepping slightly to the side, creating space without being told, his eyes flicking between the men in uniform and the old man in the chair, trying to reconcile the two images into something that made sense. The tall rider swallowed hard, his gaze dropping for the first time, the realization settling in that whatever story he had assumed at the beginning of this encounter had been incomplete, dangerously so. Thomas Hale exhaled slowly, the breath steady, measured, and for the first time, there was a hint of something softer in his expression, not pride, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if he were seeing familiar faces in unfamiliar places. He did not speak. He did not need to. The respect surrounding him spoke clearly enough, carried in posture, in silence, in the deliberate distance maintained by every man who had arrived. And as the wind moved lightly across the lot, tugging again at the edge of his worn jacket, the faded patch beneath his hand no longer looked like something forgotten, but like something remembered, something that had simply waited for the right moment to be seen. The words hung in the air long after they were spoken, not because they were loud, but because of what they carried, a recognition that reshaped everything without needing to explain itself. The man standing before Thomas Hale did not lower his gaze, did not shift his stance, and neither did the others behind him, their presence forming a quiet perimeter that was not aggressive, but absolute, a boundary drawn without lines or warnings. One of the bikers cleared his throat, the sound too sharp in the silence, and immediately regretted it, his eyes darting toward the men who had arrived, searching for a reaction that never came. They were not looking at him. None of them were. Their attention remained fixed on Thomas, as if the rest of the world had faded into something secondary, something irrelevant. The tall rider finally spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge. "Look, we did not know." The sentence trailed off before it could find its end, because there was nothing to attach it to, no confrontation to resolve, no argument to win. The man in front of Thomas turned his head slightly, just enough for his gaze to pass over the group, not lingering, not judging, simply acknowledging their presence the way one might note a change in weather, and that alone was enough to still them completely. There was no anger in that look, no threat, but there was something far more unsettling, a complete lack of interest in anything they might say or do next, as if the outcome had already been decided elsewhere. Thomas shifted his hand from the patch to the armrest again, the movement slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than before, almost reflective. "It is all right." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not excuse what had happened, only placed it in a context the others could not fully grasp. The younger biker blinked, confusion flickering across his face, not understanding how the man at the center of it all could dismiss the moment so easily, how he could sit there with the same calm he had shown from the beginning, unchanged by the arrival, unchanged by the sudden shift in power. Behind the lead figure, one of the men in uniform reached for a small device at his shoulder, speaking quietly into it, his words too low to carry. But the response came almost instantly, a confirmation, a coordination, something continuing to move beyond the visible edges of the scene. A faint breeze stirred again, lifting dust across the lot, catching the sunlight in a thin haze that softened the outlines of everything for just a second. The man in front of Thomas took a small step closer, not invading space, but closing distance with intention, his voice lowering further, meant only for the one seated before him. "Sir, transport is ready whenever you are." There was no urgency in it, no pressure, only readiness, the kind that waits rather than pushes. Thomas considered that for a moment, his eyes drifting once more toward the highway, the long stretch of road that had brought him here, that had carried him through years that no longer needed explanation, and then he gave the slightest nod, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. The formation behind the man adjusted almost imperceptibly, preparing without breaking the stillness, each movement controlled, precise. The bikers stepped back further now, no longer out of instinct, but out of understanding, creating space they no longer questioned, their earlier presence reduced to something small, something that did not belong at the center anymore. And as the scene settled into this new balance, the only thing that truly stood out was the quiet, unwavering dignity of the man in the chair, unchanged from the first moment, as if everything that had happened since had only revealed what had been there all along. The movement began without announcement, a subtle shift that traveled through the group of men in uniform like a silent signal, each one adjusting position with quiet precision, not hurried, not delayed, simply aligned with a purpose that did not need to be spoken aloud. The man standing closest to Thomas Hale stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear path toward the nearest vehicle, his posture still straight, his attention never drifting far from the old man in the chair. No one reached for him. No one rushed to assist. Instead, one of the others moved forward at a measured pace, stopping just within arm's length, waiting, not assuming, his hands relaxed at his sides, offering presence rather than intrusion. Thomas noticed the gesture, the restraint in it, and there was a faint shift in his expression, something almost like approval, the kind given not for action, but for understanding. He placed his hand more firmly on the armrest, fingers curling slightly as he prepared to move, the motion deliberate, practiced, and for a brief second, the years seemed to show, not as weakness, but as weight carried with discipline. The man beside him lowered his head just enough, his voice quiet. "Take your time, sir." There was no impatience in it, no expectation, only respect shaped into words. Thomas nodded once, small and controlled, and began to reposition himself, the chair turning a few degrees with a soft roll against the gravel, the sound grounding the moment in something real, something human. Around them, the bikers stood back in a loose line now, no longer a circle, no longer a presence pressing inward, but something that had receded, their earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness, as if any movement beyond what was necessary might disrupt something they did not understand. The younger one kept his eyes on Thomas, watching the way the men around him moved, the way they waited, the way they spoke, and something in his expression shifted from confusion into recognition, not of who Thomas was exactly, but of what he represented, a standard he had never been taught but could now clearly see. The tall rider looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers once, as if testing something that no longer felt certain, and then he stepped back another inch, giving space he had not thought to offer before. The man nearest the vehicle opened the rear door, smooth, controlled, holding it without looking away from Thomas, and the interior remained shadowed, cool against the heat outside, a quiet contrast to the harsh light of the lot. Thomas rolled forward slowly, each movement steady, unhurried, and as he passed the line of men, something subtle but unmistakable happened, each one adjusting their stance just slightly, shoulders tightening, heads aligning, a silent acknowledgement that followed him without being directed. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The respect moved with him, step by step, like something carried through years rather than moments. As he reached the vehicle, he paused, his hand resting briefly on the frame of the open door, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes lifted again, not toward the bikers, not toward the road, but toward something beyond both, as if marking the end of one chapter and the continuation of another. Behind him, the man who had first spoken remained still, watching, ensuring, not controlling, and the rest of the formation held its shape, unbroken, until Thomas Hale finally began to enter the vehicle, the scene settling into a quiet that felt complete, not because it was over, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed. The door closed with a soft, controlled sound, sealing the cool interior away from the heat of the afternoon, and for a moment, nothing moved, as if the entire parking lot had been placed on hold, waiting for something unseen to complete itself. The man who had stood before Thomas Hale remained where he was, his posture unchanged, eyes steady on the vehicle, not out of concern, but out of duty carried to its natural end. Around him, the others held their positions, not rigid, but precise, each one aware of the moment without needing instruction. Then, almost imperceptibly, the formation began to shift again, not breaking, but transitioning, one man stepping back, another turning slightly, each movement part of a larger rhythm that had been set in motion long before they arrived. The engine of the lead vehicle deepened in tone, a quiet signal that things were moving forward, and as the driver's door closed, the subtle hum of readiness replaced the stillness. The bikers remained where they were, but they no longer occupied the same space in the scene, their presence reduced to something observational, something outside the center, their earlier laughter now distant, almost unreal. The younger one exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as he processed what he had just witnessed, not the arrival itself, but the way it had unfolded, the absence of force, the absence of raised voices, and yet the undeniable authority that had reshaped everything without resistance. "Who was that?" he asked quietly, the question not directed at anyone in particular, but it lingered in the air nonetheless. The tall rider did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on the vehicle, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and for the first time since they had arrived, he seemed to understand that there were layers to the world he had never considered, lines he had never seen, until now. One of the men in uniform turned slightly, his eyes passing over the group again, not with judgment, but with a calm acknowledgement, and in that brief glance, there was a message that required no translation, that what had happened here was already complete, already resolved, without confrontation, without consequence spoken aloud. The vehicles began to move, slow at first, rolling forward with the same controlled precision they had arrived with, tires gliding over the gravel, the formation maintaining its shape as they turned back toward the road. No one rushed them. No one followed. The world simply made space. As the last vehicle passed, the faint reflection of the sun traced along its surface, then disappeared as it merged back into the flow of the highway, leaving behind nothing but the lingering quiet and the faint scent of warm asphalt. The gas station returned to itself in small ways, a door opening, a conversation restarting, a truck shifting gears, but something had changed, something subtle and permanent, like a line drawn across memory. The bikers stood there a moment longer, no longer a group defined by noise or presence, but by the absence of both, each one turning inward in their own way, reconsidering something they could not fully articulate. The younger one looked down at his hands, then back at the empty space where the vehicle had been, and nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging a lesson he had not expected to learn. And in the quiet that followed, the only thing that remained clear was not what had been said or done, but what had been revealed, that some men carried their history without display, and when it finally surfaced, it did not need to announce itself to be understood. The highway swallowed the last trace of the vehicles within seconds, their presence reduced to a memory carried in the minds of those who had witnessed it, and yet the space they left behind felt fuller than before, as if something unseen still lingered in the air, steady and undeniable. The sun hung low now, casting longer shadows across the lot, stretching the outlines of everything into something softer, quieter, and for the first time since the moment began, the world moved without tension, without anticipation. The younger biker shifted his weight and took a slow step forward, not toward anything in particular, but toward the place where Thomas Hale had been sitting, his eyes tracing the faint marks left by the wheels on the gravel, shallow impressions that would disappear with the next passing wind. He crouched slightly, studying them as if they might offer an explanation, then exhaled and stood back up, his expression thoughtful, changed in a way that could not be undone. The tall rider remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the road, replaying the sequence in his mind, the arrival, the silence, the salute, and the words that had followed, and he realized that none of it had been about dominance or fear, none of it had required force, and that understanding settled deeper than anything else, heavier than the embarrassment, heavier than the realization of his mistake. He ran a hand across the back of his neck, then let it fall, his posture loosening, not in defeat, but in acceptance of something larger than himself. Around them, the others began to move again, slowly at first, conversations returning in low tones, engines starting, but the energy had shifted, stripped of its earlier edge, replaced by something quieter, more aware. The gas station attendant stepped back inside, the door closing with a soft chime, and the truck driver leaned against his cab once more, though his eyes lingered on the empty space a moment longer before turning away. The younger biker glanced at the tall rider, hesitating, then spoke, his voice steady but lower than before. "We got that wrong." It was not a question. It did not need to be. The tall rider nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, and for once, there was no attempt to dismiss it, no attempt to reshape it into something easier to carry. He looked out toward the horizon again, where the road stretched on, unchanged, and then back to the ground beneath his feet, as if measuring the distance between what he had assumed and what he had just learned. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We did." The words did not fix anything, but they did not need to. The lesson had already taken hold. One by one, the bike started, engines rumbling back to life, but even that sound seemed different now, less like a declaration and more like a continuation, something moving forward rather than pressing against. As they pulled out of the lot, their formation looser, their pace more measured, none of them looked back immediately, but the younger one did after a few seconds, glancing over his shoulder at the place where it had all happened, committing it to memory without fully realizing it. The wind picked up just enough to sweep across the gravel, softening the marks, erasing the lines, leaving the surface clean again, as if nothing had occurred there at all. But that was not true. What had happened did not need to leave a mark in the ground. It had already left something far more lasting, a quiet understanding carried forward in silence, the kind that does not fade with time. Respect is not demanded in the moment. It is recognized when it finally appears, and by then, it is already too late to pretend it was never there.